Hey, everybody. For my student leadership interview, I got the pleasure to interview a mentor of mine, a local pastor on the west side of Greenville who is doing ministry right alongside me and my church over at Woodside Baptist Church. His name's Chuck Mayo. Chuck is currently he serves as the head pastor at Heritage Baptist Church on the west side of Greenville. Uh, Chuck's a really interesting guy. He served in the Navy for 24 years. He was a master chief for the nuclear power training unit and was a senior class instructor as well. He's been learning about leadership his entire life. He has so much wisdom to bring to the table from a really diverse background. He has a lot of leadership from young in life, from the Navy, from being a pastor for the last 8 years in Greenville, and really just from his whole life in general. Um, One of the things that I was most excited to ask Chuck when we started the interview was just how he would define servant leadership. I was really curious to see how he would just define the term servant leadership. And in true Chuck fashion, what he did is he explained servant leadership through an illustration. He loves illustrations, and I think he loves them so much because you dwell on them, you think on them, and I respect that. So the illustration he gave for servant leadership, just off the cuff, no prep at all, he said, a servant is someone who puts their master's needs above their own and their master's guests' needs above their own as well. Um, he used that illustration, and it's really within the definition of a servant, of like the biblical definition of what a household servant was. When we look at the household codes in Paul's letters of what servants were, how they lived, and what their main purpose was, is that the servant's task was to serve the master. The servant's task was to fulfill the mission that the master set in place for them. And so, as we seek to be servant leaders, he said, a servant leader must first and foremost be submitted to God, submitted to our primary source of headship, which is God alone. It can be really easy, he said, to misunderstand this principle and begin to serve your congregation first. If you're a pastor, it can be easy to serve your employees if you're a boss, if you're in any sort of leadership position or whatever leadership position you find yourself in as a parent. It can be easy to pour into those under you and serve them almost too much, he said. He talked about this same principle at work where when you're a servant leader, when you only serve those under you and you cater to their every need, you actually take away from the mission, the overall mission. When you subvert headship and you subvert submission to proper authority, you're actually taking away from servant leadership, which I thought was a really interesting take. He said, you see, servants serve a master and servants serve the master's guests. Yes. Therefore, we're to love and serve God first and then serve others as well. However, sometimes organizations, they prioritize any kind of organization or any kind of venture out there, something that's starting new, a church, for instance. We have to prioritize the mission over everything else, because when we don't, and when we cater to everyone's needs, and we subvert submission, we subvert headship, what we're actually doing is taking away from the overall mission of the organization, the family, the leadership relationship, whether that's a mentor-mentee. When the mentor only serves the mentee and you subvert that submissive role, what you're actually doing is taking away from the mission and the purpose of headship in the first place, the purpose of leadership. Now, there is a place for servant leadership, obviously, but what does that look like? And Chuck fleshed that out a whole lot in our interview. He really brought it to light, not in the second question I asked him, but more so in the third. And my third question for him was, and we looked at a passage from Matthew 23 about how Jesus was talking to the Pharisees at the time, and as he was really talking against the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, he called them out. And the main principle that he drew from his teaching when he spoke against them was that you see, God, he will exalt those who are humbled, and he will humble all those who are exalted. That's in Matthew 23. verses 9 through 15 is where Paul, or excuse me, where Jesus really highlights that principle of those who humble themselves will be exalted, but those who exalt themselves will be humbled. And so, with that principle in mind, um, he began to talk about how a servant leader, in rightful headship, can lead well. And the way that they do that, the way that we're supposed to do that, is the way that Jesus did it, right? Surprise. The way Jesus did that was, yes, by serving those under him, right? He washed the disciples' feet. He walked through life with them. He provided food for them, whether it was bread and fish that miraculously came from heaven, or whether it was his knowledge, his leadership. I mean, they followed him. Yes, they followed his lead. But what Jesus did is that he raised up mature disciples. We know that Jesus delegated his authority. There's a story of how Jesus delegated his spiritual authority for the disciples to actually cast out demons, to go and proclaim the good news of the kingdom. So Jesus delegated his authority, and Chuck really brought out how servant leadership really ought to be raising up your replacement. That's a phrase that he likes to talk about a lot, is raising up your replacement. And I've met with Chuck for coffee before in the past, and he talks a lot about that same concept of proper servant leadership. If you're trying to raise up leaders for the church, for a business, for leaders in your family, you want to have young men who grow up to be men that will one day be great men of the household. You are raising up your replacement as you're doing that. And servant leadership looks like not simply serving with, by giving your kid a meal, okay, which you ought to feed your kids, but by giving them gifts, by serving them and taking their responsibilities on yourself. Sometimes, sure, that there's a place and time for that, but true servant leadership is delegating authority and raising up the next generation, so that you can hand the baton off, and so that your leadership has a lasting legacy. Something really interesting that that Chuck mentioned, he picked two guys, two men that we probably all know, John MacArthur and John Piper, and he kind of put their ministry side by side, and he prefaced this entire illustration. He prefaced his entire illustration after I asked him the third question, which is, how do you see upside down kingdom principles playing out in our churches today, right? How do we see those who are exalted being humbled, and those who humble themselves be exalted? And he got into that. He said those who humble themselves as leaders, and rather than taking the stage and becoming the best, most influential leader they can, rather than doing that and attaining some sort of status or book deal or speaking event where you're paid a ton of money or prominent, whatever, instead of going that route, rather you actually develop more leaders, make more mature disciples by handing off your authority so that you're raising your replacement. And so he took two guys who are great examples of faithful men in the ministry, two men that I highly revere and who are Orthodox evangelicals, John MacArthur and John Piper. And he put their ministry and their legacies really side by side. And just as an illustration, out of total respect for both of them. But he looked at John MacArthur's legacy and he looked at John Piper's legacy. And we put these two side by side. And John MacArthur, his legacy is in the Master's Seminary, in a lot of his teaching and his preaching, where he takes the pulpit oftentimes more than anybody else in his church. And so John MacArthur's legacy, which he knew a lot more details about than I do. I've listened to John MacArthur preach, but he talked about how John MacArthur's legacy is rooted in his name, whereas John Piper, at the church he serves at, he's delegated more of that authority out. He still has a big name for sure as an influencer and all that, but when you look at John Piper's ministry, he's really delegated much more authority to his website, to the ministry, and so he's been able to raise up, not that John MacArthur hasn't, but Piper has intentionally raised up more leaders to be his replacements in certain areas of his ministry, whether that be publishing, whether that be preaching, whether that be taking care of members, all the things, right? And he just used that as an illustration. But I thought there was a ton of wisdom in that, is that in as we seek to be leaders in the church for the kingdom in North America, we want to humble ourselves so that we will be exalted, maybe not today, right? But in glory, that we will hear those words, "Well done, my good and faithful servant, as you have made disciples and you have loved me well," so that you're raising up disciples and teaching them all the things that I've commanded you. And that's our goal, is to raise up mature disciples. And a big part of that is to humble ourselves as leaders, be a servant leader in serving others coming up into the ministry, inspiring others to come up into the ministry so that we can hand off that baton and delegate those tasks to the next wave of leaders. But in order to do that, a really, really important point that he made is that from day one, we have to speak life into our disciples. The call to ministry is not something that we leave passively to the Holy Spirit, but we have to inspire others to follow us as we follow Christ. So our spiritual example set by the tone of our own lives is important. And so from day one, when we start to engage the lost, we want to share the gospel with them so that they receive it, but then inspire them to be instruments of God's grace as well, so that as we raise disciples, they see an opportunity in the church that they're in to get plugged in, to get involved, and to be active in making more disciples for the kingdom, as opposed to just simply sitting in a pew and warming a chair on Sunday morning. We want to see disciples made that are passionate about the gospel and passionate about sharing it and passionate about becoming leaders, because we have a shortage. I mean, there's no shortage of spots for people to fill in our churches, or churches to plant, not just in North America, but in the world at broad. So I'm really thankful for this assignment. I learned a lot from Chuck. I just only went through 2 questions, but from all my questions and all the time I got to spend with him, I'm very thankful for this assignment. I learned a whole lot, and I'm excited to hear how everybody else learned from their interviews as well. Thanks.